Hello, everyone. Good evening. Happy Juneteenth Eve. Welcome to our second iteration of Context Unlocked. Allow a couple of moments for people to come in. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to Context Unlocked. This is our second iteration of this webinar mini-series where we will be talking about aligning foreign affairs history with current events. And tonight we will be doing a 200-year history of Cuba, as well as talking about within this time period, Cuba and U.S. relations. So if you are here with us in the chat or on live, please go ahead and type where you're joining us from, just so we can see where we got people. And if you're watching this on live as well, go ahead and share this with someone. If you're watching this as a video recap, go ahead and share it with someone too. Another welcome. This is Context Unlocked, and if you're wondering, what is Context Unlocked? It's a webinar and mini-series curriculum that is striving to fill in some historical knowledge gaps on some of the most pressing foreign affairs issues, connecting them to the constantly unfolding news of the day-to-day. And they're hosted by me, Trinity, and I am the Policy and Action Assistant with Sojourners. And for anybody unfamiliar, Sojourners is an organization and publication that works at the intersection of faith and social justice, and I work within SojoAction, which is the mobilizing department of Sojourners. And I have a degree in international relations and Latin American studies, so that is the driving force behind the series as a whole, but especially our topic that we will be getting into tonight. And just, for many of us that are living in empire, or those of us who were raised in empire, this means that we have been largely educated by empire, which has left a lot of the knowledge gaps, albeit intentionally, in people's understanding of foreign affairs. So I hope that if nothing else this evening, I hope you can say that you've learned something. So a little brief on what we'll cover. Just a disclaimer, this is a very, very packed presentation. Following our last session, everybody said that they wanted more information. They're like, Trinity, it wasn't long enough. There could have been more. I wanted more. So here you go. And just another point about history. History is a nuance-filled, complex, and oftentimes very violent thing to discuss. And these educational webinars are designed to inform, but it is genuinely impossible for me to cover the full depth and breadth of over 200 years of ideology, cultural, or economic history in an hour. And so if we're all interested, there will be a few additional resources, as well as any answers that are placed in the chat throughout this webinar. The answers to those will be sent out to all registrants, even those who are unable to join us. So again, throughout the session, please feel free to put any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer them and send them back out to everybody. And I'll be a reminder for that later. So for what we're covering, we're going to do the same thing that we did in the last session and talk about a few helpful terms. Some of them are repeat terms, but are very much repeated in this theme as well as last session's theme. Talk about a little bit of why we decided to discuss Cuba right now. And then we're going to get into a crash course of Cuban history from the 19th century to 2020, which is a long time, so buckle up, as well as the damaging effects of the current U.S.-imposed blockade on Cuba, and a little bit of how you can take action during this time. So here's some helpful terminology. A repeat is geopolitics, which is just the study of how geography, economics, and demographics influence politics and foreign policy. A new term is embargo, which is an official ban or restriction placed on trade or commerce with a specific country, usually enacted by a government or an international body. And then two other familiar terms from our last session, the blockade, the physical or military isolation of a country, region, or harbor to prevent the movement of goods, people, or communications. And lastly, sanctions, the deliberate government-inspired withdrawal or threat of withdrawal of customary trade or financial relations. So hopefully these definitions will make any information that you hear tonight or again in the news in the future make a little bit more sense. Getting into a little bit of Cuba, why now? Here are some very recent news articles that you may have seen, that may have come across your social media, or that may be new to you, that are just getting into a little bit about the global effects that the current blockade of Cuba is causing. And also, it's really important to note that there's a severe lack of global solidarity with Cuba when Cuba has displayed solidarity for others on many occasions through various means. So, this is really important to discuss right now. And the news in Cuba is also being reported on, but it's not being talked about as broadly as it should be. So, this is an effort to bring Cuba into the center of discussion. Beginning our historical analysis, we are starting in the 1800s, and coming out of the 18th century, going into the 19th century, colonial Cuba had a very high reliance on sugarcane, which was produced by slave labor. The population boomed during this time from 150,000 to 1.3 million, and the number of enslaved Africans increased from 39,000 to over 400,000. This number grew following 600,000 more kidnapped and enslaved Africans arriving following being sold from Britain to Spain. This marked an agreed end to the slave trade, but it was only agreed despite many Cubans wanting to continue. Similarly to the South in the US with cotton production during this time, the sugar industry was experiencing mechanization and industrialization. Steam power mills, or ingenios, and railroads were instrumental during this period. And this industrialization forced out many small farmers and began destroying forests. Further, Cuba began having workers from Mexico under very similar labor conditions to enslaved Africans, as sugar began to account for 4/5 of all exports, a third of the world's sugar. And this began creating very complex and unevenly distributed forms of class that would spread out throughout history within Cuba. In the late parts of the 19th century, the US began scoping out the island as an area of interest for potential acquisition, a curiosity that will continue for decades, upon decades, upon decades. And refusing to give Cubans political autonomy, Spain tried to tighten its grip on rule, fighting Cuba in the 10 Years' War. This was one of the first of many efforts for Cuban independence. It was very difficult to get everyone on board for such a mass revolt, largely due to the enjoyments and comfort upper class planters and sugar producers had, and essentially they didn't really care who was in charge so long as they continued to enjoy these comforts. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, called the father of Cuba, issued a Grito de Ayala, which declared Cuba as independent. Still, people questioned him, as many disagreed with his desire of manumission, or the act of a master freeing a slave, or as well giving room for the US to annex Cuba. Spain, as a response to this, issued the Pacte de Zanjón, with full of empty promises for reforms, but it is what ended this particular war nonetheless. Following this, a new uprising began, and the Spanish government failed at instituting these empty promises and reforms. However, still as a result of this, slavery was abolished effectively in 1886. José Martí, a writer and poet who was exiled for speaking out against the Spanish in his works, coordinated and mobilized political organizations and founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892. He died during the Battle of Dos Rios on May 19, 1895, but the Cuban Revolutionary Party would be something that would be important for essentially forever. The battles continued as Cuba declared itself the Republic of Cuba in September of 1895, but Spain continued its fight. This time as well, anti-Spain sentiments began to be held throughout the US, and this led to the very well-known mysterious explosion of the USS Maine, which led to the Spanish-American War, where the US captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, beginning US occupation of all of these places. The Treaty of Paris only gave Cuba freedom in name, as the US began to occupy and attempted to control every aspect of Cuban governance, militarization, and electoral politics. The US forced aspects of its culture onto Cuba, sowing seeds of segregation into the fabric of the Cuban electoral system, which barred Afro-Cuban participation. This moves us into the birth of the Republic of Cuba and its beginnings, starting with the Platt Amendment of 1901, which gave the US control of essentially all of Cuba's foreign affairs, its economy, and the establishment of a now very infamous naval base, Guantanamo Bay. Following two US controlled or installed leaders, Jose Miguel Gomez led Cuba from 1909 to 1913, while the economy began stabilizing itself once again, but not without corruption and anti blackness. He funded the newspapers that uplifted the government and drowned out dissent, and he also wanted to stifle the voices of Afro Cubans who were arming and speaking out against the racism, mistreatment, and exclusion that they were experiencing. Their participation in the wars that were before this period of time were largely being ignored now that it was time to actually begin cultivating a new Cuban system and society. And also, Spaniards had been immigrating to Cuba in mass and were allowed jobs that resulted in less employment opportunities for Afro Cubans. This led to a war in 1912 where Afro Cubans were arming themselves, mobilizing, and speaking out against the racist and classist systems within the Republic, bringing attention to the fact that under this new independent form of governance, away from colonial rule, their treatment continued to remain the same. What followed were broad and coordinated attacks throughout Cuba by Afro Cubans to demand equality and change to such a system that mimicked the bounds of colonial Cuba. And this level of organizations that Afro Cubans had during this time baffled anyone that stood against them at the power of insurgency spreading by way of mouth alone. And this was the beginning of Afro Cuban revolutionary ideals that followed throughout the history of Cuba and just Black revolution in general globally. Still, corruption continued sequentially with the administrations that followed the Gomez administration. During the administration of Gerardo Machado, many uprisings and a US assisted overthrowing of his leadership occurred. This office removal affected people across ideological lines, but broader failure to collectively unite on the creation of a new type of regime laid the groundwork for the systems that we all know emerged in the 60s in Cuba. Moving into the Batista regime, President Batista rose the ranks from humble beginnings and organized the sergeant's coup to receive power after Machado was overthrown. He created a new constitution, readjusted their political system to match that of the United States, and aimed to create an economic system that mirrored FDR's Great Depression era New Deal policies, as well as frameworks that matched this as well. He personally appointed leaders from the Communist Party to his cabinet and included key representatives from trade unions. However, at the same time as all of these initiatives, he was secretly enjoying for himself a large share of the nation's funds. He then fell victim to his own laws in 1944, as he had written in the new constitution that no president could seek immediate reelection. He attempted to have a successor win the election that followed his successor lost, and thus he went in exile in Miami. However, in 1952, he staged yet again another coup and took power by force of arms. And as ideology became an important discussion following his second occupation of office, anytime ideology comes up, you can expect enter the US stage right. Batista gained the President Eisenhower's support, along with apparently the American mafia, for his efforts in being anti-communist. This is where we begin the time period of the Cuban Revolution. Young lawyer Fidel Castro and his supporters who had been challenging Batista openly and organizing against him were all being sent to prison for the things that they had been speaking about Batista. Calls to release them from prison led to mass mobilization and an insurgency that Batista and his military were not prepared to handle at the time. During a period of exile, Fidel Castro met a young revolutionary, Che Guevara, who had been traversing the whole of Latin America, watching history unfolding and the damage the US had been taking against the region, and was in search of a cause to commit himself to. Cuba became his cause. Castro was eventually granted amnesty, and news of Batista's human rights violations caused the US to completely abandon him as a supporter. Guevara led troops against the Batista regime and was a part of the final blow to the Batista regime as it fell. Isolated and without sufficient means to counter insurgency, Batista exiled himself in the Dominican Republic and in Spain until his death as he left office. So much more crucial information could be shared here about those involved in the revolution, as well as all of its nuances, but that genuinely could be a separate webinar in and of itself. Here are the beginnings of a post-revolutionary Cuba, which is pre- and post-Cold War time period. The Communist Party of Cuba took office and ideological power during this time, devolving the capitalistic system that it had once operated under, creating a centrally planned or command economy where a central authority figure dictates economic activity and production goals, and the means of this production are publicly owned. Also at this time, literacy and its healthcare system were nationalized and became a very major priority, which would become absolutely vital to Cuba in the years to come. They also developed a very close bond to the Soviet Union, as well as a number of economic measures that were designed to take a firm position against any kind of US presence within Cuba, which led to a historical event that I'm sure many of us did learn about in school in some sort of capacity, being the Bay of Pigs invasion by the US. Congress had given Eisenhower permission to take retaliatory action against Cuba, starting with the end of sugar purchasing from Cuba and the placing of an embargo on all exports going to Cuba with the exception of food and medicine. This act kind of began to lay the groundwork for what would eventually be the Bay of Pigs invasion. Under a new administration, John F. Kennedy's, on April 15th, 1961, three US manufactured airplanes piloted by Cubans bombed Cuban air bases. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a US backed and funded invasion of Cuba that followed 2 days later, on April 17th, 1961, by 1,500 Cuban exiles that were opposed to Fidel Castro. The invasion was uneven, and those sent were not able to fully carry out the operation, and thus 1,100 invasion members were captured and imprisoned subsequently. Castro demanded $28 million in reparations for construction equipment, but these conditions for the release continued to change until eventually $53 million in food and medicine were received. The following year, another very key Cold War related historical event occurred between the US and Cuba, being the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's not hard to imagine a world where at any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22nd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun. and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
Hopefully that video was helpful and a little bit more of an understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want to take this time to briefly discuss Cuban migration in the U.S. I think it's really important to discuss during this time, largely because Cuba's ideological shift of that time period and its newfound heavy reliance on the Soviet Union divided many Cubans. It resulted in a mass exodus by many, especially wealthier Cubans and skilled workers. And this, as we know it, has contributed largely to the culture of the U.S., most specifically in Miami, Florida. Cuban migration into the United States accounts for extremely important conversations regarding immigration in general in the U.S. Because at the time, the U.S. had no desire to see a successful Cuba by any means, and thus accepted Cuban immigrants and gave them immediate pathways to permanent residency in ways that immigrants from other countries were unable to receive. Hundreds of thousands of Cuban migrants came into the U.S. over several years, with the Cuban population within the United States growing from 79,000 to 439,000 between the 60s and 70s. This pseudo-preferential treatment would continue for decades until diplomatic relations resumed between the U.S. and Cuba during President Obama's second term. And pivoting back to our historical timeline, this is a pretty big window of time, just FYI, just kind of going over the 70s to the turn of the century and even laying the groundwork of the Cuba of today. Beginning in 1976, Fidel Castro created a new constitution and began initiatives to reorganize the political system, giving himself the position of both president and prime minister. Cuba frequently mobilized in support of revolutions globally, sending troops to fight in the civil wars of other countries during this time as well. As the ideology of the Soviet Union also began to change in the late 80s, they began to shift away from Cuba, eventually withdrawing their troops completely in the early 90s. This shift was very detrimental for Cuba as it lost its crucial economic and military support. The continued U.S. embargo only exacerbated this as unemployment began to skyrocket and food, medicine, and natural resources were in critical shortage zones. At the turn of the century, people outspoken on Castro faced jailing and repressive measures, and international critique continued. Small measures were taken ever so often to provide economic relief, such as the petroleum trade agreement made with Venezuela. On the U.S. front relating to this time period, Guantanamo Bay opened in 2002 in Cuba as a response to the infamous War on Terror. It once held over 800 Muslim men, many held simply for suspicion of terrorism. This prison has been the home of Islamophobia and lawlessness for almost 25 years. 15 people remain incarcerated there to this day, despite decades of pressure to act by human rights and social action groups. In 2006, Fidel Castro began giving power to his brother Raul Castro Ruiz, who at the time was the head of the armed forces and the president of the National Assembly. 2 years later, he would assume the presidency after his brother Fidel had held office for essentially 49 years. As Raul implemented social and economic changes that were different from that of Fidel's, the EU lifted its 5-year-old sanctions, which was something that was very disagreed upon by the US at the time. Privatization, both business wise and property wise, became legalized in the early 2010s, much to the shock of the people who had followed the country's history and its socioeconomic system. During the Obama administration, phone conversations between President Obama and Raul Castro, facilitated by Canada and Pope Francis I, led to the resumption of diplomacy between these two nations. Political prisoners from both nations were released, and Castro made pressing strides to have the US blockade of Cuba reevaluated as it was codified into law at the time. In 2016, President Trump began his attack on President Obama's initiatives in Cuba and created new travel and business conducting restrictions between US citizens and the businesses associated with Cuba and the Cuban government. When Raul Castro stepped down from office, his successor, Miguel Diaz-Canel, took power, being the first leader in decades who was not a part of the Cuban Revolution directly. The economy began to suffer this time, with Trump's travel restrictions continuing and being incredibly damaging to the Cuban tourist economy. And Venezuela's oil crisis caused Cuba to scramble to find new sources for oil. This continued to worsen as Trump continued to have rounds upon rounds of new different types of restrictions on travel, on business, as well as the growing sanctions on Venezuela's oil at the time. The last thing needed during a time like this with these economic conditions was a global pandemic. And despite the economy essentially plummeting at this time, Cuba maintained control over the spread of the COVID-19 virus in the beginning of the pandemic, even sending doctors abroad to help globally. Despite the spread prevention not being maintained throughout the full time, with cases rising, its measures for treatment continued. They may have had the inability to purchase foreign vaccinations because of their economic position in the embargo, but their robust national public health system gave them the ability to seek cultivation of their own. And Cuba was the only country, sorry about that. Cuba was the only country in Latin America that was able to develop and manufacture a vaccine for COVID-19. This brings me to my next point, talking about Cuban resilience. Despite decades of turmoil and the continued blockade, the Cuban people have dedicated themselves to showing up for themselves in the world time after time. Speaking within public health, Cuba has developed immunotherapy treatments for cancer and has been at the forefront of the most critical health research for decades. Additionally, Cuba has a free medical education program, in addition to its free healthcare, and has trained thousands upon thousands of clinicians as a result. Over 30,000 of these physicians have been sent to aid countries throughout the African continent and the Latin American region throughout time, and over 103 countries have benefited from Cuban medical assistance. Turning to literacy, Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates and has since the revolution. It is at 99.7% of nationwide literacy, while the global average sits at 86.5%. They have also continued to be dedicated to helping others and being a strong point, despite even having attacks on their embassy here located in DC. The Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. has been violently attacked twice, once being from open fire in 2020, and then again in 2023, as 2 incendiary Molotov cocktails were thrown at the building. Now to connect the context of what we have learned with what we're seeing today, as action is extremely desperately needed, Trump has made countless threats of taking over the nation and recently imposed an oil blockade and has called Cuba a national security threat. Because of this, Cuba has faced a critical fuel shortage and has been experiencing blackouts for months now. This attack on Cuban life is unacceptable, as people have been struggling to find food, to continue working, and many hospitals and schools have had to close down from the unreliable power operations. This leaves thousands of people in danger. Cuba has been paying it forward across the world for decades and has been on the receiving end of broken promises by so many nations it has supported medically and sociopolitically. The Cuban people are suffering and need people to stand up for them. Here's a first step in how you can take action. SojoAction has met with the deputy head of mission at the Cuban embassy here in DC, having crucial conversation about the need for global solidarity and the spread of information about the harms being acted upon the nation at present. To conclude today's session, I am sharing the action alert that we have recently launched as a means to take action and to urge Congress to end the blockade. And you can find it by the link in the chat or at sojo.net/Cuba. Also moving to a brief attendee poll, just wanting to know, we have one more Context Unlocked session remaining, and I want to know what people would be interested in learning. I have a few ideas, but I'd like to have some audience participation in that. Give folks a couple more minutes, but it's totally fine. We can also just ask everyone, but I was just curious. Just want to give everyone a thank you for listening. I really appreciate everybody coming out. And we have, again, one more Context Unlocked. It will be on July 18th, also at 7 p.m. And there's also an opportunity for you all to subscribe to our weekly Truth in Action Roundup, where we very frequently are discussing what's going on in Cuba, as well as global, throughout the world and throughout our country. And you can also view all the rest of the upcoming events that we have going on at sojo.net/events. So thank you so much again. And then also, I meant to say, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will go ahead and respond to those in the response email. So I'll give people a couple seconds to do that if you have anything. Thank you so much for everyone that added things to the Mentimeter. I'm seeing some more places now. Oh, so many good options. I really don't know what I'll end up choosing. But all right, at this time, I'll go ahead and end us. Thank you so much for listening to so much history, and I hope that you learned something. Have a great rest of your evening, and have a happy Juneteenth.